Welcome back to 1337, the Futura Podcast. I'm Max, and with me as always is Sophia. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating and often controversial world of free speech.
That's right, Max. And we have a ton of intriguing material to explore, all from the works of Michael Shermer books, essays, articles. He's really covered this topic from every angle.
It's a real treasure trove of thoughts on giving voice to even the most, well, let's just say challenging perspectives. Kind of like giving the devil his due, which is actually the title of one of Shermer's essays and a perfect starting point for our deep dive.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why give a platform to those we fundamentally disagree with? It's almost like you're endorsing their viewpoint, which of course is not what Shermer's advocating.
Right, but then what's the point? Why bother understanding those views if you already think they're wrong?
Well, that's precisely where Shermer's argument gets interesting. See, he believes that truly combating bad ideas requires understanding them. Where do they come from? What makes them appealing to some? What motivates people to hold them? It's about engagement, not silence.
So it's more about strategy than giving them a free pass. Kind of have to know your enemy, so to speak. Okay, that makes sense. But how do we handle extreme cases? Like, what about Holocaust denial? Shermer uses the trial of David Irving, a Holocaust denier who was imprisoned in Austria for violating their hate speech laws, as a jumping-off point for this very issue.
Yeah, that's where things get really murky. While silencing hateful rhetoric like Holocaust denial is understandable, Shermer warns against the potential for misuse of those hate speech laws. They could easily be used to silence dissent or even legitimate challenges to historical narratives, regardless of their accuracy. It raises the question, who gets to decide what's hate speech and what isn't? Who holds that power?
Yeah, who watches the Watchmen, right? Feels like a slippery slope. It's like the example Shermer gives about the ACLU defending neo-Nazis' right to demonstrate. Their argument was if you silence one group, you're setting a precedent that could be used to silence anyone, even those fighting for good causes.
Exactly, and this free speech debate isn't confined to the political and social arenas either. It spills over into the scientific world as well. Shermer, for example, shares his experience at Pepperdine University, where he faced resistance to the theory of evolution.
And that wasn't even a debate about the science itself, right?
Yeah.
It was more about pre-existing beliefs clashing with scientific evidence.
Precisely. It just goes to show how deeply our worldviews can affect how we interpret information, even in fields that strive for objectivity. He also mentions the case of Richard Sternberg, a scientist who came under fire for publishing a paper that supported intelligent design.
That case really exposes the potential for bias within the scientific community.
Yeah.
It's like even in science, there's this pressure to conform, and going against the grain can have serious consequences.
It definitely underscores the need for open discourse, especially when dealing with controversial ideas. Suppressing debate could hinder scientific progress and keep us from getting a clearer, more accurate picture of the world.
So whether it's Holocaust denial or challenging established scientific theories, Shermer seems to be advocating for engagement and dialogue over censorship as the most effective response.
That's definitely a key takeaway from his work. He consistently argues that combating bad ideas with more speech, better speech, reasoned arguments, that's ultimately more effective than trying to silence them. Censorship can backfire, creating martyrs, and further entrenching those views.
And this brings us to what's arguably the most heated battleground for free speech debates today, the college campus. Shermer really dives into the rise of microaggressions and trigger warnings, concepts aimed at protecting individuals from harm, but which have also fueled anxieties about oversensitivity and censorship.
He uses these examples to illustrate a broader point. Even well-intentioned efforts to create safer spaces can unintentionally stifle open discourse. He shares stories about speaker disinvitations and the pressure on students to conform to specific viewpoints, raising concerns about the chilling effect this can have on intellectual exploration and debate.
Yeah, it begs the question, how do we balance protecting individuals from harm with promoting an environment where diverse, even challenging ideas can be openly expressed and debated?
$1 million question for sure. And Shermer doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He emphasizes the need for critical thinking, empathy, and a willingness to engage with different perspectives. And get this, he even uses a rather unconventional example to explore these challenges, designing a society for a future Mars colony.
Okay, now that's a curveball. What does governing a Martian colony have to do with free speech here on Earth?
Think of it as a thought experiment, a way to tackle the challenges of balancing freedom and security in a completely new setting. How do you create a system that allows for individual expression and dissent while ensuring the safety and stability of a small, isolated community where everyone's survival depends on each other?
I see what he's getting at. It forces us to think about the core principles we want to uphold in any society, no matter where it is. So what specific challenges does he anticipate in this Martian context?
He draws parallels to historical examples, like the mutiny on the HMS Bounty and the society that formed on Pitcairn Island. It's a fascinating look at the dynamics of power, freedom, and the difficulties of governing in an environment with limited resources.
So is he saying we're destined to repeat history's mistakes on Mars? That the same power struggles and limitations on freedom would inevitably crop up?
Not necessarily. He's highlighting the importance of being aware of those potential pitfalls. He actually coined the term extraterrestrial tyranny to describe the possibility of power abuse in any resource-controlled environment, whether it's a spaceship or a Martian colony. He argues that we absolutely need safeguards to protect individual rights and freedoms, even in those extraordinary circumstances.
So even in this hypothetical scenario of building a society from scratch on Mars, those fundamental questions about freedom, security, and the limits of individual expression still apply. It really highlights how relevant these debates are, no matter where we are.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the heart of Shermer's work, the need to constantly engage with these complex issues, to challenge assumptions, and to find solutions that balance individual liberty with the well-being of the whole group.
It's really interesting how those big ideas about freedom and control pop up in these hypothetical scenarios like the Mars colony, but also in those super real issues that we deal with here on Earth. And, talking about those real pressing issues, Shermer's analysis of gun control really stuck with me, particularly after tragedies like Sandy Hook.
Yeah, one thing that stands out in Shermer's work is that he isn't afraid to dive right into the data and statistics. He makes the point that even though those huge high-profile mass shootings like Sandy Hook, they dominate the headlines and fuel all those passionate discussions, focusing solely on those events might actually be distracting us from the bigger problem.
So he's saying we need to widen our perspective beyond just those really shocking but statistically rare events.
Exactly. He urges us to consider the broader issue of gun violence in its entirety, which includes not only the mass shootings, but also individual homicides and even suicides. And you know what? Those actually make up the vast majority of gun deaths. It's a perspective that you don't hear often in the often very heated gun control debate.
Yeah, it's definitely a different angle. He doesn't seem to be pushing for one specific solution, but rather encouraging this more data-driven, nuanced approach to understanding the complexities of the whole problem.
Right, exactly. He even presents data on gun ownership and gun death rates across different countries, challenging some of the usual assumptions about the relationship between guns and crime. It's not about advocating for a particular policy, but about getting past the emotional rhetoric and grounding the discussion in actual evidence.
It's like a call for this clear-headed, level-headed analysis, which seems to be a big thing in Shermer's work, actually. He tackles these controversial topics straight on, but he always encourages us to think about different viewpoints, weigh the evidence, and not fall for those overly simplistic solutions.
It's a super valuable thing to remember, especially nowadays where there's so much information overload, and all those strong opinions often drown out any chance for a sensible discussion. Shermer reminds us that critical thinking and a willingness to engage with complex issues are like the essential tools we need for navigating these, sensitive and challenging issues.
This deep dive into Shermer's work has really brought home the point that asking those tough questions, even when the answers aren't clear, is so important. And while we're on the subject of tough questions, I feel like we need to tackle what might be the most profound and honestly a bit unsettling topic he explores, and that's the nature of evil itself.
Right, yeah. Shermer doesn't shy away from exploring those really, really dark sides of human behavior. In his book, Banning Evil, he pushes us to really try to understand what drives those seemingly senseless acts of violence and cruelty.
It's a pretty heavy subject, but it feels like one that we need to wrestle with if we're ever going to get to the bottom of those behaviors. It's not about excusing those actions at all, but more about looking beyond those simple black and white ideas of good versus evil. It's about trying to grasp the complexities of what makes people do what they do.
And he even introduces the concept of the banality of evil, which is a chilling idea if you think about it. It suggests that totally normal, everyday people can be driven to commit horrific acts if the circumstances are right.
That's a really, really powerful concept. It makes you rethink those assumptions about who's capable of evil and forces you to consider those situational factors that might lead to these terrible acts.
It's like acknowledging that darkness exists inside all of us to some extent, and then understanding the conditions that can make that darkness grow and take over. It's a sobering thought, but a necessary one. Good and evil aren't these fixed things. They're more like a spectrum of human behavior influenced by this intricate mix of individual, social, and historical forces.
And this exploration of evil takes us to an even deeper question, one that philosophers have grappled with forever. Free will versus determinism.
Yeah, the classic debate. If our actions are basically predetermined by our genes, our upbringing, or some other external force, can we really be held accountable for the choices we make? It's a mind-boggling question. So where does Shermer stand on this whole issue?
Well, he's honest about not having a definitive answer. He looks at different perspectives from both the philosophical and scientific angles, acknowledging just how complex this whole thing really is.
So he explores arguments from both sides, presenting evidence that our biology and environment play a huge role in shaping how we act. But then he also recognizes that feeling we all have, the feeling of agency, like we're actually making choices and influencing the course of our lives.
It sounds like he's not picking a side, really, but more like encouraging us to engage with this question, think about the evidence, and understand that the answer might be much more nuanced than we initially thought.
Exactly. He's inviting us to really think about what it means to exist, what factors drive our thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's as much about self-discovery as it is about philosophy.
And that journey, as Shermer seems to suggest, is just as important as finding a concrete answer. It's about embracing the complexity, recognizing that we don't know everything, and being open to the possibility that the answers are far more intricate than we first imagined.
Yeah, it's like he wants us to be comfortable with those gray areas, those situations where there isn't an easy black and white answer.
Yeah.
And that, nuanced approach is clear in how he handles a bunch of different topics, even those that are often seen as kind of fringe or even pseudoscientific.
Yeah.
Take Scientology, for example. He doesn't just dismiss it as some crazy cult.
Right.
Instead, he actually digs into their beliefs, their practices, that whole wild Xenu story about where human came from.
Oh, yeah, that whole thing.
He examines it all, applying that same critical thinking that he uses for any other belief system. What's really interesting is how he doesn't approach it with this mocking or dismissive tone. Like, he doesn't ridicule them.
Yeah.
Instead, he looks at the evidence, thinks about the psychological and social reasons why people might be drawn to it.
Yeah.
And in the end, he lets the listener decide for themselves. He gives you the information and trusts you to think for yourself.
Right. But he's not afraid to point out the potential for things to go wrong, especially when groups use these manipulative tactics or take advantage of their members. He even compares Scientology's super secretive nature to how totalitarian regimes control information and silence dissent.
It's like a wake-up call that being skeptical isn't just about debunking UFOs or ghosts.
Right.
It's a skill you need to navigate this world that's overflowing with misinformation, manipulation, and ideologies that can have some pretty real-world consequences.
So then how do we become good skeptics without turning into cynics who just dismiss everything?
Right.
How do we stay open to new ideas while still being, discerning?
I think that's where this idea of intellectual humility comes in. Shermer talks a lot about how we need to be open to new information, willing to change our minds if there's solid evidence.
Yeah.
And accept that even our most deeply held beliefs could be wrong. He's not saying to blindly believe science or any specific ideology, but to adopt this mindset where critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning are king.
I like that.
Yeah.
And he even talks about his own experience starting as a young Earth creationist and eventually becoming a strong advocate for science and reason. It shows that intellectual growth is possible, and being willing to challenge your own assumptions is key.
Totally. And he also points out how important mentors and role models are in developing that skeptical mindset. People like James Randi, Martin Gardner, and of course Carl Sagan, they inspired so many with their passion for science, critical thinking, and just the awe of the natural world.
Yeah. Their work shows us that being skeptical isn't about tearing things down. It's about looking for truth and understanding.
Yeah.
And speaking of Carl Sagan, I found Shermer's take on the meaning of life really insightful, especially his perspective that doesn't rely on anything supernatural. It ties back to that amazing Sagan quote, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself."
It's such a beautiful perspective. It really makes you feel small, but in a good way. It shifts the focus from searching for meaning outside of ourselves to recognizing how incredible it is that we exist at all conscious beings in this vast universe.
And Shermer builds on that, saying our purpose isn't something preordained, it's something we create through our interactions, relationships, and pursuit of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. And he even gives some practical tips for finding meaning, like building deep connections with others, doing work that aligns with your values, and contributing to making the world better. It's this very human-centered approach that emphasizes how interconnected we are and the responsibility we have to leave things better than we found them.
It's a powerful message, especially in a world that can feel so chaotic and uncertain sometimes. It reminds us that even if we don't have all the answers, the journey itself, seeking knowledge, building relationships, having a positive impact, that's where the real meaning lies.
Yeah, and maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this deep dive into Michael Shermer's work. It's about being okay with the mystery of it all, appreciating the wonders of the natural world, and using our reason and compassion to create a more just, humane, and, well, enlightened future.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of Michael Shermer. It's been a thought-provoking journey full of challenging ideas and inspiring insights. If you're creating more deep dives into fascinating topics, come on over to 1337podcast.com.
We've got a whole library of episodes just waiting to be discovered.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.
Strength and honor. I am Spartacus.
Thanks for watching. Tap into 1337podcast.com.